All right, everybody, welcome to our second episode of Voices with VIPs. Today is a very special episode because we have two very special guests. I'll start by introducing Mohammed. Mohammed is actually one of our employees at IT. He's our Director of Communications. So if you see our social media, he's the one that's posting and coordinating all of the things on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. So that's Mohammed. And then we also have one of Mohammed's professors from college. This is Dr. Tappan. And I'm going to give each of you guys a chance to kind of tell us a little bit about who you are and why we brought you on here today. So I'll start with Mohammed and then we'll go over to Dr. Tappan.
Thank you, Cody, for having us both. As Cody mentioned, I work with the communications team here at IT. I have a visual impairment myself, so one key aspect I try to always prioritize when we develop communication strategies would be accessibility. So hopefully you always see alt text or captions. Cody and I have known each other for, I think, 4 or 5 years now. We met at the Maryland School of Blind Capabilities, and he's taken me under his wing. So he started IT and he's kindly let me come and join him. I've learned a lot. And then Dr. Tappan was my religious studies and philosophy professor at Towson. And I was very fortunate to have him 4 times. I took 4 different classes with him. And I think we developed a very incredible professor-student relationship. So that's kind of my connection here at IT and with Dr. Tappan.
Awesome. And I'll have to just give my own perspective on that. Mohammed is always very humble and thinks that I take him under my wing, but in reality, Mohammed runs and owns the communication department. And without him, I would be completely lost. So just wanted to throw that in. Let's move over to Dr. Tappan. Dr. Tappan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi. Again, I want to reiterate what Mohammed said. Thanks, Cody and Mohammed, for inviting me on to share my experiences. As you know, and I think the audience will know, this is not my area of expertise. I don't have training in working with people with low vision or visual impairments or anything like that. But as a professor at Towson University in the greater Baltimore metro area, I teach religious studies, mostly Islam, also religious ethics, comparative religious ethics like bioethics and environmental and animal ethics. And Mohammed was interested in taking a class with me, and we worked together well enough that it turned out to be 4 classes. And I couldn't quite get him to do a major, like double major, but 4 classes, I think he's kind of an honorary religious studies graduate, in my opinion.
Love it. Okay, awesome. Yeah, and really, I want to reiterate too, at IT, we try to do, when we do these Voices of VIPs episodes, we want to kind of take something from out of the box, a story or voices that are not usually heard, and especially me talking to Mohammed and telling me this story about your guys' relationship. We really wanted to kind of highlight that. So let's do that today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of break this down into 4 different sections. And we'll have a couple of questions, and obviously we love tangents. So we'll kind of start with our introduction and kind of telling the story of the relationship that you guys had in the classes that you had together. We'll go on to some successes, what worked with those classes. We'll talk a little bit about barriers to access, and then our last topic being what should students with disabilities come to college prepared with. And so, yeah, let's kind of talk about how you guys came to be professor-student relationship. I'll start with Mohammed. Just tell me a little bit about your journey at Towson and maybe the decision to take that first class with Dr. Tappan.
Sure. So I graduated in May 2020 with my bachelor's degree in mass communication. So I wasn't even in Dr. Tappan's college. Dr. Tappan teaches in College of Liberal Arts, and the mass communication department is in the College of Fine Arts and Communication. So I had my first year advisor recommend Professor Tappan's course. It was Intro to Islam. And I was a little bit on the fence just because I wasn't sure what to expect. And when I met Professor Tappan, within like 5 seconds, I knew we would connect very well because I had asked one question, and that question was, "Could you please provide everything in Word document format?" And he instantly said, "Yes, I can do that." And then we kind of just had a long discussion on what religious studies 203 would encompass, what would be accessible, inaccessible, and how could we work around a lot of the challenges. How can we work with the ADS, or Accessibility and Disability Services Office, to succeed? So that's kind of how I met Professor Tappan.
Okay, awesome. Sounds good. And Dr. Tappan, what was going through your head when Mohammed first reached out to you? What were kind of your first initial thoughts?
Yeah, well, one thing we can probably circle back to this later when we talk about some of like the things that work well.
Yeah.
I mean, Mohammed didn't just email me the day before class or, even a week before class. I think he emailed me the semester before the class. So like, you sign up a semester ahead, and he emailed me pretty soon after that and said, "Hey, I'm interested in, taking your course. Can we meet to talk about it?" And so that was useful, and it made me start thinking right then, because like I said, I don't have any experience working with. We work with a lot of students from ADS, but usually with things like on the autism spectrum or something like that. So it's students who just need more time to work on an assignment or some kind of accommodation like that. So, working with students with other sorts of impairments or visual impairments in this case was totally new. And I thought, wow, what am I going to do? But I also thought, I can't think of any reason why we can't make it work. So let's talk about it and see, what Mohammed's needs would be and what I can change for the class. So I didn't exactly know what to think, but I just tried to keep an open mind. And I think because, again, one of the things we can talk about, Mohammed is so, Cody, kind of like you were saying, kind of really takes charge and ownership of things. He was able to convey, what he needed, and really gave me a sense that he's game for doing whatever it takes to take the course and to do well in it. So it just made me feel comfortable with, stepping foot in the water and seeing what we could do together.
Yeah, and really, I guess, keeping that open mind and yeah, like you said, I like how you said, if there's not a reason not to do it, why not just power through,
Right.
Right. Yeah. And I guess with that, let's kind of just jump into well, I guess let me circle back to Mohammed. I know you talked about how you started that first class, how you'd made the decision to take that first class. What compelled you then to go back for another 3 classes with Dr. Tappan? What was the first class experience like, and what were some things you were thinking about?
So we encountered some challenges in Intro to Islam, and some of those challenges would be, we had some documentaries in different languages that had English captions, but obviously I was not able to see them. And so I'll be honest, I had this idea that maybe one of my classmates could read to me, but I was hesitant to ask because I assumed that in college that doesn't happen. And so it was really Professor Tappan's idea of asking a classmate, "Well, why don't you read to Muhammad?" And a peer did come and read with me. We met after class, I think in the library. And I wish I knew this earlier, but when peers do this, for any VI professionals listening, make sure you get the peers who are helping your students paid, because sometimes the ADS departments will pay for that. But going back to what worked, we did ask ADS for an English translation, and they kind of got it to us on time, but it wasn't really as good as you would want. And so Professor Tappan did a lot of things like taking initiative. So if there were, this may have been from another class, but if there was, let's say, a graphic novel, all throughout my education, I've been told always avoid graphic novels, don't touch them. they're inaccessible. Well, we had a graphic novel in Professor Tappan's biomedical ethics class, Lissa, and Professor Tappan reached out, I believe, to the publisher or author or both, and he really took initiative in trying to help me gain access to that graphic novel. And it's really those types of discussions, those types of qualities of a professor that really drew me back. And then I also have to add, towards the end of Intro to Islam, I had mentioned to Professor Tappan how his class was a little bit different. It actually felt like I didn't have a visual impairment many times, because honestly, I just had to show up, listen, take notes. It was really on me at that point to hopefully excel academically. And it really wasn't on the professor for not accommodating, because Professor Tappan had done everything a student like me would have wanted. And so towards the end, when I told him that, he had said, "You're welcome in all of my classes." And so at Towson, my major was 60 credits, and I needed another 60 to get to 120 to graduate. So as I'm trying to fill in my gaps, I'm thinking, okay, strategically, where could we have the most success? And it would be with a professor like Dr. Tappan, who is always willing to work with his students. And trust me, I wasn't the only one. I saw other classmates. I don't think I've heard a bad review of Dr. Tappan. So all of the peers, I think, would be in line with some of the things I'm saying.
Awesome. I love it. Okay. Yeah. And I guess with all of those kind of things that you brought up, let's kind of go into what worked in these classes and some successes that you guys had. And I guess we'll start by talking about some of those things that you brought up, Mohammed, starting with, I guess, the documentary. Dr. Tappan, can you tell us a little bit about this documentary that
Sure.
Mohammed's talking about, and what was the challenge there?
And Dr.
Yeah.
Tappan, sorry about that. I think it's Divorce Iranian Style I was
That's
referring
right.
to.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think actually, I don't know that was our first, that was in our first class, right? I think Divorce Iranian Style was in our Islamic ethics class, maybe.
Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
can't remember. It might have been an intro to Islam, but so I do know, I was thinking about this too. I did want to talk about that case, but I think in Intro to Islam, I usually show a documentary in class. I show segments of a documentary in class about, the history of the Iranian Revolution, and it involves a similar challenge to the documentary that Mohammed has talked about, because even though it's an English documentary, there are parts of it where people are speaking Persian or Arabic, and that's subtitled into English, which doesn't work if you have visual impairment. And so I think in that case, I think I warned Mohammed ahead of time that that is going to be an issue. But I think what I ended up doing in that instance was, it wasn't a lot of material, so I think I just read the subtitles. I think I just told the class, hey, I'm going to just read these so that everyone, because sometimes in a classroom, people sitting in the back can't see the subtitles very well. So I just said, you know what, I'm just going to read these subtitles. It's only going to take a minute or two, and that's how we dealt with that one. For Divorce Iranian Style, though, that's like I think like a 60-minute long film, and there are lengthy sections that are subtitled, and so
Right.
that wasn't going to work to that degree. But it was just one of these things of being open-minded. Like I would probably be beneficial if we professors had more training in the type of accessibility issues that come up, but because I was a blank slate, I just kind of thought, like, what practically seems like it could work, and then let me ask Mohammed and see if that makes sense to him. And so, yeah, that was my idea for that Divorce Iranian Style documentary was, can we find a peer from the class or someone from ADS to sit with him, watch the film, read the subtitles, but also describe if there's something going on that's,
Right.
Because that's part of the challenge of all these things, graphic novels, films, art and architecture, sometimes like what's left unstated, but you're supposed to grasp it visually. And so
Right.
for all of these cases, it was like when I spoke with the person who was working on the project with Mohammed, I said, you want to also just you don't want to just read what's there. You also kind of want to describe the scene and any nuances. And I'm not sure how successful that was. I mean, Mohammed's papers were excellent, but I don't know how successful the helper was versus just Mohammed being able to write a good paper.
The student was really good. He was really good. I remember he was very well spoken, and he did describe some of the visuals
Okay.
that I don't think I would have picked up through the ADS captions translation.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and I think that that's the beauty of this, of talking to you guys too. And I think, Dr. Tappan, you have this great perspective where you're like nice and fresh to the disability field, where you know, sometimes when we're in disability services, we get really in the weeds of devices and systems, and this has to be correct. And really, I think that the beauty of that solution is, if it works, it works. And that's pretty much the end of the day. If it worked for Mohammed and you ask Mohammed, and Mohammed's like, yep, that sounds great. And we come back and, you know, Mohammed is like, yep, it worked, you know, then that's it. That's the solution that works. And I think that that's a really great perspective to walk away with as people who are like entrenched in the details of accessibility, you know. And then kind of on that too, let's talk about that graphic novel, because personally I'm very interested in how that went. So Mohammed, you want to kind of start there? What was that experience like? Tell me a little bit about the assignment and the novel, and what was the solution?
Sure. So please forgive me if I don't remember everything precisely. I think we
You
may
already
have
passed the class, so you don't
Right.
have
Yeah. You don't have to prove anything.
right. No. I do like to be accurate though with the memories. I think we may have had a paper or an assignment tied to the graphic novel. So having access to the graphic novel was important to me. So I think what ADS did was they may have given me just the text. The interesting aspect about Lissa or other graphic novels would be there are visuals, and so the visuals accompany the text. In other words, you have to have someone describe the visuals while you're gaining access to the text. So, you know, for those of you who are familiar with image descriptions or alt text, they're kind of that kind of doesn't exist with a physical graphic novel. And if I'm honest, we could have probably pushed ADS to do a little bit more, because if you've ever written alt text for a graphic, ADS probably could have done maybe a bit more detailed version of alt text and then just given me the text, and we could have had it sorted out. But instead, Dr. Tappan found another peer to work with me. I think there was a collaboration between Dr. Tappan, ADS, and I would just meet outside of class to have Lissa read to me, but also visually described.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. So very similar to the first one. And just to clarify, Lissa, that's the name of that novel, is that right?
Yeah, it's the name of a graphic novel. And Mohammed is right. So I know the author of that. She's a colleague at another university. I know her very well. And this is something she's interested in as well. She's very, interested in making things accessible. And so I had seen in some cases publishers of graphic novels have tried to make them accessible to people with low vision and so on. So I asked her, and she said, unfortunately, they don't have something like that. And I think they may have come up with something by now. I think there's enough interest in it, and then just hearing that, hey, students are trying to use it and may need a little bit more accessibility. I think they have come up with a supplemental reader or something like that for that. But yeah, I thought let's see if there's anything out there, since some publishers are doing that. They didn't have anything, so then it was kind of like, all right, what's our plan B?
Plan B, yeah. And although it's not like the most I guess engaging solution where we're like, oh, we have a peer, but again, it's one of those things that it's like, oh, well, we have what we have access to, and if it works, it works. And you know, if we got access to the content, then so be it, you know.
And the other thing that I tried to do with that, and I change a little bit every semester, so I'm not sure exactly what it was like when Mohammed went through, but I usually also have the students read some of either the book she wrote, where that graphic novel is is based on, or some of the articles she wrote that are, again, tied to the book or the graphic novel. So even if, again, because the graphic novel is kind of lighter on text, right? Because much of the information is being conveyed visually. So,
right.
And not just for Mohammed or anyone else with accessibility concerns, but for any student, a lot of times they don't pick up the nuances in the graphic novel either. So having them do some background reading that kind of explains things a little bit more can be helpful. So but I think that material is available, and that was kind of my backup also, was like, let's say we just can't get the graphic novel thing to work. I mean, Mohammed's a good student. I can't just be like, well, you can't finish the class, right? So what else can we do? You know, I didn't always give that graphic novel. Sometimes I had students read her book and write about it instead. So I had something in my back pocket. Like if it doesn't work out,
Right.
I can still assess Mohammed in the same way that I've assessed students in the past, and that I'm assessing the students now, just through a different medium.
Right. Right.
So that was useful. So again, I don't know if there are going to be professionals out there, professors or other instructors who might be in the same boat, but I think if you're really heavily reliant on some kind of visual media for an assignment or for a class, thinking about a backup or something that gets you pretty much to the same point, but that would be more accessible, is good to have.
Right. Making sure we're assessing the same objective, just in a different way. Right.
That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then if I could just jump in. So Professor Tappan said something very interesting. He just said that, well, I couldn't just tell Mohammed you can't finish the course.
Right.
I'm going to be honest. I took Professor Tappan's classes as core classes, and then just on my own, right? So I had a professor, I won't name names, but I had a professor within my own major, and for two required courses, he did say to me, you can't take my class. I had another visually impaired peer who graduated alongside me. Both of us were told on multiple occasions, you cannot take my class. So if you wonder why I kept going back to Professor Tappan,
right.
You know, on one end, I'm being told, don't take my classes. And then on the other hand, with Professor Tappan, I'm being told, you're always welcome here.
Right. And I think that, and that almost goes off topic, because I think that also reminds me of the conversations, Mohammed, you and I have as employer and employee, where when we think about a new task for you to do, and neither of us have had experience in doing that task with low vision, you being never having done the task, and me not having the same visual impairment that you do, that we kind of have to have faith and be like, let's try it, you know, instead of, you can't do that because we're not sure how to do it, right? It's kind of that partnership problem solving thing that we do. And I can think of so many tasks that you do for IT on a weekly basis that at the beginning, neither of us were sure how it was going to work. But you know, I think that's a really good point.
I think that's very common though with individuals like me, where I feel like, especially at university, some professors, but even university departments, aren't really prepared. And I think the reason, if I were to guess, is there aren't enough of us versus, let's say, sighted peers. And I think that's why, you know, you might not find campuses being that accessible. And so I'm not just talking about Towson now, I'm talking in general. I think if there were more of us, I think you'd see a difference in approach and a difference in experience.
Right. And I think you're right on that, especially and I think that really it comes down to like having a fear, right? And anytime that I do any type of vision training, I think one of the things that I keep going back to is just don't be afraid about things that you don't know, because a lot of times in disability, you know, when we are working through a solution, service provider and user, right? Whether that's teacher and student or employer, employee, whatever. We don't know where that's going to go, but we still got to try, you know? So yeah, I love it.
One thing I'll add, and I tried to hide this from Professor Tappan, but I think it's okay to reveal this now. So I always want to give 100% in all of my classes because that's just the type of student I like to be. However, if I have an instructor like Professor Tappan, who in my opinion will go the extra mile, then I feel like I have to do even better than 100% in the course, because if I don't, my fear is, well, if the instructor is trying, I knew this wasn't the case with Professor Tappan, but in general, my fear is if the professor says, oh, I've spent all this time working on accommodating you, but your grades aren't good enough, or you're not paying attention, or, if you give any of those feelings to your teacher who is accommodating you, it kind of can come off the wrong way. And so even with Professor Tappan, who I don't think thought that way, it was still a fear, even in the fourth class. And one unique
Right.
thing I'd like to mention about the fourth class, I mentioned how I would always meet with my professors and half a semester before. That's done on a strategic way. I have a lot of academic strategies because I know I have to do a little bit more than the average student if I'd like to be at my best. So one thing I want to mention about, I took a Sufism course, which was my final course, and I don't think we met in person. Everything was done through email, and that's how good we got when it
Yeah.
came to working together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. That's right.
Yeah. Awesome. And I think that it's interesting that you have that fear that you mentioned where you're like, oh, I'm being accommodated, so I have to do good. And it kind of leads me into my next question, which Dr. Tappan, you kind of hit on a little bit. In the documentary and the graphic novel, you talked a little bit about how accommodating Muhammad kind of made you think about accommodating not only just Muhammad, but other students in the class that, like you said, like might sit in the back or might not be catching the things in graphic novels. How do you think having Muhammad in your class and going through these adaptations, how did you think about like you might shift your course in the future to accommodate other students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely something, I mean, even prior to Muhammad, I've been thinking about these things. I was on the board of one of the professional organizations that I'm part of, the Society for the Study of Muslim Ethics. And when I was on the board, our president was a fantastic professor, Dr. Keisha Ali. And one of her mandates when she came in was to improve access to people with various disabilities and whether that was literally like physical access in meeting spaces or access to our materials. And again, we don't get training on this academically. We get some other, training, Title IX training, things like that. That's important, but they don't teach us any of this stuff. So that was really, watching her was really my first experience to think about, like, yes, A, this is important, and B, here are some of the ways we can do it. And so then, working with Muhammad, I was kind of trying to put some of those things in practice, and thinking about, I mean, on the one hand, using graphic novels, using film and things like that really does engage most students. They get tired from just reading all the time and reading dense articles and things like that. So having a different perspective helps them. So it's not something that I want to give up, but I also want to make sure that it's accessible to everybody. So I have to try to think of creative strategies like we've been talking about. I mean, in general, I've found that the experience of working with Muhammad over those 4 classes has just been helpful for me in working with other students, even if they're not like part of the ADS system. I was teaching my Intro to Islam class last semester, and one of the, maybe it'll come up in our barriers, Muhammad already hinted at it, but one of the issues we found was, using PDFs, which is like the standard, can be problematic with the devices that LB students might use. And so, we have to think about putting those into Word documents. When Muhammad worked with me ahead of time, we could do that, right? But I had a student who didn't have an ADS memo. She didn't ever say she had low vision or vision impairment or anything like that, but she said, hey, I read these on a device and I couldn't open this one. And so that immediately I knew it's a PDF. I've had this experience before. You probably need it in Word. it doesn't sound like you have an ADS memo either. This is going to be really helpful for you in the future. So I got her in touch with them and got that ball moving. And if it had just come up, if I'd never worked with Mohammed, I wouldn't know what was going on, right? And I wouldn't have been able to help her.
Right.
But this time I was able to help her, and like it solved the problem right away. She got what she needed right away. So it's been useful in those two ways. One, thinking as I plan out a class, how can I make sure this material is accessible to everybody? And then B, when these issues crop up, I have a toolbox and some experience to respond to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think that you kind of hit on one of the largest barriers that we have in visual impairments, where if somebody outside of visual impairments thinks about making things more accessible, what do they go to? They go towards movies and graphic novels, right? Because the large percentage of people that we hear about having disabilities are usually like learning disabilities or developmental disabilities, and for people who have those types of disabilities, when they hear about when they get a movie, they're like, oh, thank goodness I don't have to read, right? But then in visual impairments, we're like, oh no, not a movie with subtitles.
Yeah.
So it really strikes that chord of like, disability and accessibility really are individual experiences, and we can't just make everything accessible to everybody all the time. We really have to think about who are we trying to target this to, and how do we make it as accessible to them specifically. So
and also, let me say one other thing about this too, because it ties in with Mohammed talking about his strategy of like a semester ahead of time or half a semester ahead of time reaching out to the professor. As professors, we have an idea about how we're going to teach our course the next semester, but if you're reaching out a half a semester ahead, probably none of us have finalized that syllabus. So if a student reaches out ahead of time and is like, these are some concerns I have, whatever the issue might be, that gives us some time to think about it. Like, okay, am I going to use something that's going to be difficult for the student to access? How crucial is it? If it's not super crucial, I can switch it out for something else. If it is really important, I can keep it, but think about a strategy, now 6 months ahead of time or 5 months ahead of time of how to make that work with the student. So that is really useful for the professor's side of things to think about, okay, how can we do this, rather than having it sprung on you and you don't have the skills in the background to easily respond to it.
Absolutely. And really thinking about how much more difficult it would be if you came to the first day of class and had your syllabus all ready to go, and all of a sudden you have, oh, can you change? Well, not really. We already have the syllabus that's already passed out, right?
Yeah. Students have purchased the books or whatever, bookstores ordered, movies, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And speaking of the syllabus, we had to do some unique things because so for those in the vision field, you might know the human word braille note Apex, right? I've heard good and bad things about it. I've heard that it's great at just being a basic note taker. That's all it does, right? I will be honest, for all 4 of my years at Towson, the Apex was what I used. It wasn't until my senior year, my last semester, that is when I got using NVDA in a screen reader because of Cody. And so the issue with the Apex was we would have PDFs, and the Apex can't interpret most PDFs. It will crash, or it will just say blank if it tries to interpret. So ADS would take the PDF and it would convert it into a MS Word file. And we had to be very particular. You had to use Word 97 to 2003 for some reason. Then what would happen is the Apex is taking that old file type and it's converting it into what we call a BRF file, right? And so when you do all of that conversion, I can go and look at Professor Tappan's syllabus, and it might say, okay, you're supposed to read, pages 15 through 37 or something, right? And sometimes professors don't want you to read an entire chapter. They may want you just to read a certain section. what ended up happening is we were kind of operating like a screen reader. I would go to Professor Tappan and I would say, unfortunately, I don't have page numbers. So could you please give me headings? What heading do I start at and what heading do I end at? And I think he even modified the syllabus. I had like a slightly modified syllabus where instead of page numbers, I had headings.
I see. I
And-
see.
And this, I'm glad you mentioned that, Mohammed, because that's to answer Cody's point. Like, again, what else have I learned? I do that for all of my syllabi now because, again, the
Yeah.
easiest way, and just the way I was taught too, the professor's going to say either read a whole chapter. It'll just say chapter 1, or
Right.
they'll, like Mohammed was saying, they want you to read some, but not all. So like read pages 1 through 27, but if you don't have the page numbers or you don't know where on page 27 to stop because it's not clear,
Right.
that's not super helpful. And yeah, I would find too with students who were other students who were ADS with ADS memos who would read the syllabus and then do the reading, and let's say they had to post a discussion post about it or something, they wouldn't always read what I wanted them to read. They wouldn't stop at what I thought was a natural break. They would read and comment on something else. So once I went through with Mohammed and was like, okay, I read from chapter 1, the beginning, until it says whatever, something about Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad's move to Medina or something like that. And that was easy for him to do. I would just do that in general for all my syllabi, because that way it was very clear to students where to start and where to stop.
Right. I can imagine a section that like goes a little bit onto page 27, and then the rest of 27 is not even related to what you guys were
Right.
talking about. Yeah.
This would
happen.
This would happen so frequently in other classes, and I would miss Professor Tappan's syllabus because it would be like, oh, I finally know where to stop. And it really depends on how willing the teacher is. So in Professor Tappan's case, he was super willing. Some professors will kind of go halfway and they'll get it, and then some just won't. It's kind of on me to figure it out. And like I said, when the Apex throws page numbers, like there were times I had page numbers, but then they would be like out of place and they wouldn't match up with the headings.
Right.
So, oh, and then by the way, just to kind of finish off this Apex analogy, when I get a BRF file, if I have to like put my own answers into a document, that whole conversion process goes in reverse. So we take a BRF file
Right.
and make it a Word file, and that messes everything up even more. So when you're submitting a paper, you have to look at a computer, not the Apex, to format it to make sure that there aren't weird spacing issues.
Yeah, yeah, and honestly, to kind of keep going on this topic, let's get into our barriers, right? Speaking of the Apex, not to throw shade at the Apex, yeah, let's kind of talk about that. What were some of the talk to me a little bit more about some of the barriers that you faced, Mohammed, especially like with the devices and the conversion. What was that process like?
Well, so Professor Tappan would have multiple books in a semester that we would read. And for me, no problem. I'll happily read them. There were days in Professor Tappan's class where I would say, unfortunately, I'm not able to access this because something is bricking the system. I sometimes could not troubleshoot everything. I would do my best. Like if ADS didn't necessarily convert a PDF correctly, which unfortunately that happens sometimes, then I would have to come up with my own makeshift ways of converting PDF. So my makeshift way is to upload the PDF to Google Drive. And then once it's uploaded, you open it in Docs, and then hopefully Google's OCR is good enough to then where I have to download it to a Word file, and then I bring it into the Apex, and then you have to hope it works. And sometimes that doesn't work because even Google's OCR it'll give you a Word document, right? But then the words are jumbled, and in the TVI, in the low vision world, TVIs would call this, you have to clean up the document.
Right.
And sometimes ADS wouldn't always know how to clean up the document. And it would take way too long for me to go through and clean up the document, because it's like, think of it as like a double or triple reading where you should just spend, let's say, 30 minutes reading,
Right.
I don't know, 15 pages or something. This, the whole troubleshooting plus the cleaning up the document might take 2 or 3 times longer than what the average student would spend. So sometimes that would get a little bit frustrating. In all honesty, for those vision professionals listening or watching, I know note takers are great. I personally like human-wear devices. That's why I had the Apex. I use a Mantis Q40 Braille display today, but I would highly encourage you to start teaching your students screen readers, whether it's JAWS or ChromeVox or NVDA, because Professor Tappan, if I had known how to use NVDA, which is a screen reader, it's completely free, so no one has to pay for it. If I knew how to use that back in your classes, so many of our challenges could have, I'm not saying they would have, but they could have been avoided.
What were some of those challenges that now using a screen reader, using a computer, what were some of the things that looking back would have been easier?
Well, first, if we just took the Apex out of the equation, you're just working within Docs or Word, right? There's no conversion taking place.
Right.
If you have an accessible PDF, which maybe we can outline that later, NVDA sometimes does a really good job with PDF. Actually, I'm surprised at how good it does, how good it handles PDF. So you can navigate with headings, you can navigate with landmarks. PDFs aren't perfect, and I still don't like them, but with the screen reader, it's much more accessible versus the Apex, where there's independence. You're not relying on ADS staff or someone else.
Right.
It's just there, and you just have to hope the software works correctly.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think, I mean, obviously everybody knows my opinion about screen readers, but I think that it would have been a lot easier for sure. And then kind of tossing it back to you, Dr. Tappan, thinking, I mean, you're in this position where you're kind of, you're working within the structure of the university system. What types of things would you say that you, if you had the power to, you would change to make working with students who are low vision or have a disability in general easier for you?
I think I have 2 points for this. The first one, as I've mentioned a little bit already, we as faculty just don't get good training in this.
Yeah.
At the most, we're just told, we have an ADS office. If you have students with any type of a accessibility issue or any other sort of need, they'll give you a memo and just accommodate that. The memo kind of explains what to do, but not in a lot of detail. And like we've been talking about, most of the students are students with some type of learning disability or something like that, neurodivergent. It's not students with hearing impairment or vision impairment or something that needs a little bit more thought, right?
Right.
And so I think, that was definitely a barrier for me as the professor, was, again, not knowing where to start. And kind of feeling disempowered by my institution on how to help Mohammed or help other students. So that's a bigger institutional issue that I think needs to be addressed. But the other thing too, and I've heard Mohammed talk about this a couple of times. I might be lucky because I have good colleagues in my department, but I'm really surprised that a professor, especially in a student's major, is like, just don't take this class because I'm not going to make the effort to, like, that seems strange to me. And so I think, students preparing for college just need to be aware that you might find faculty who are really willing to work with you, and you might just find some who are going to stonewall you.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes for the ADS. I think it was DSS when Mohammed was there.
Right.
Again, we don't have a lot of interaction with them as faculty, and the things that they do for us, they do pretty well. It's like, they draft the memos, they give that to us. If we're giving an in-class exam, but a student needs more time, they will set up an exam space for them and collect the exam and return it to. They're really good with all that stuff, but I don't know what it's like when they're working with a student like Mohammed with a different type of impairment, because I often heard from Mohammed, like he's been saying now, like they wouldn't do the things correctly, or they wouldn't get them to him on time. He would ask me ahead of time, let's provide the readings to them like in the beginning of the semester so that it's ready, by the middle of the semester when we need it.
Right.
We would do that, middle of the semester would come and I might get an email from him saying they didn't do it, or they sent, whatever, a blank file or whatever. So even when it seems like they are responsive and they are trying, again, whether they just were having difficulty or whether, I don't know what the issues were. I was surprised as a faculty member that
Yeah.
Mohammed encountered so many issues, and it shouldn't be that way, but I think a student would have to be prepared for
Yeah.
that not going smoothly, even when you do things ahead of time, even when you as the student do everything right, there's going to be hiccups.
Yeah.
And if I could kind of jump in with a few things here that I think are important.
Absolutely.
So unfortunately, I don't like saying this, and I don't want to discourage any visually impaired students. I kind of had to expect things to go wrong, because you just know they will. Actually, in Professor Tappan's class, when things would go right, and I'm thankful most of the time they did, it really did feel like I did not have any sort of visual impairment. It felt like I was on par and level with everybody. And that I hope that means a lot to Professor Tappan, because I can't, if I'm honest, I cannot say that about any other professor or any other class. And I really wish I could. But what happens is you get so caught up in, oh, well, what if this goes wrong, or what if that goes wrong? And um, I'll add and say, I feel like I overworked ADS, because they only have one person, the assistive technology coordinator, that she's really the one responsible for doing everything we're talking about. And so she's kind of inundated with not just my requests, but anyone else's requests. And I
Right.
always thought, well, if ADS could just, I don't know what the budget's like, I'm not sure, but I always thought they needed 2 or 3 assistive technology coordinators, because that would take the load off of one person. And they're a pretty small department, at least at Towson. I don't know about other schools.
Right.
And then another thing I want to say that I think is important, a lot of times when we talk about people with visual impairments, we wonder why they don't socialize or why they don't have friends. At university, if you have a visual impairment and you want to academically succeed, you may have to sacrifice social experiences more than even the hardest working sighted peers, because it will take you longer sometimes to complete tasks. So you may appear as somewhat of an outcast because of the way you operate. Like I got so used to, unfortunately, even talking robotically a little bit, because you're looking for headings all the time. You're looking for,
Right.
you're looking for all this technical stuff that the average person isn't, and it just sometimes becomes a little bit a part of you. And then you see that it's time to sleep, and you're like, oh wait, who did I talk to today?
Right. Right. And it's unfortunate that that has to be like that, really. And it really is a combination of things that it's from which device are you using, how well were you trained on that device, what is the university system like, right? And really to kind of give you guys another perspective that I don't think about, like very, very rarely do I think about, but where I went to college, in our disability support services department, they actually hired me as a student who was in the vision program learning Braille, to be the only person to transcribe Braille in our university. And I think there was another student that was working with me, but that kind of shows you how limited the resources are. It's just, I was an undergrad student who was taking a Braille class, and they were like, oh, great, you can use this embosser and transcribe all of these students' files. And that job lasted very, very quickly. Like I was out of there real quick because I felt like I was doing a disservice more than anything. But it really is, it's hard because you can see the university's disability support services budget, and you're like, well, I guess that's what they had the resources to do, and at the expense of students like you, Mohammed, right? And really kind of putting it on you as the student to have to do all of these extra things to be successful. So on that note, I want to kind of do 2 things before we end. The first one is, Dr. Tappan, this is kind of directed towards you. We asked on our Facebook group what is something, and our Facebook group is full of vision professionals. So people who work with usually school-aged children with visual impairments, but also adults as well. We asked, what would you want to ask a professor like you about having a student with a visual impairment in their class? And we had a couple of poll options. The first one is how to handle inaccessible materials. So that was our top vote. What would you say to that if you're a professor in a class who has a student with a visual impairment? How would you handle inaccessible materials? Just kind of lightning round. What do you think?
Yeah. Again, see if it's possible to get it in a format that they can read it, or like we talked about before, someone can work with them to explain it. If not, have a backup option. There's so many materials that we could use as professors, and we sometimes cycle through it anyway because we get bored of teaching the same thing. So
yeah.
If you run into that, you can say, do you have something else? If you're the student, do you have something else? And I guarantee your faculty member is going to have something else they can give you, hopefully in a format that you can access.
Absolutely, that's a great tip. I love it, and especially from somebody that knows how they create course syllabi, and hearing that you guys have other things that teach the same content. That's definitely very useful. How would you say this is the second highest rated one? How are classes made accessible? So how would you say a college class is made accessible to a student with a visual impairment?
I mean, I guess just based on my experience working with Mohammed, just seeing what the needs of the student are and what I can provide. And there may have been changes now because of COVID. So there are classrooms equipped with recording capabilities and things like that. So that could be something worth looking at as well, if that would be useful. Yeah, just in my case, working with Mohammed, I didn't even have to ask so much. Mohammed, as we know, is on the ball and just said, here's what here's how I'm going to take notes. Here's how I'd like to ask questions. Here's what I need, and here's what works for me. Is that going to work, or how can we adapt it for your class? And so whatever he asked for was reasonable, and we just made it work. So again, one of the things I found really helpful in general is just having a relationship with the professor you're working with. They know you, you know them, and you can ask for what you need, and they can find a way to give it to you.
Awesome, I love it. And kind of on that point too, the last kind of section I wanted to cover was really that connection between the professor and the student. As we were kind of developing the concept behind this this Voices for VIPs episode, I know that this is something that Mohammed emphasized a lot. So Mohammed, I'll kind of throw it to you to tell me a little bit about how important and what the function of developing that relationship with your professor is.
Sure. So I honestly wanted to attain academic success, but not just a passing grade. You can pass a class with a B or a C. For me, I don't know if it's just me being brought up that way. I don't know if I don't know. I just always wanted to have the very best grade that I could have. But going deeper, you can get an A, and then this has happened to me where you get an A, but you feel like you learn nothing. So I not only want the good grade, but I want the good education. So I would like both. And that combination is sometimes so difficult to get. So in order for me to try to reach that goal, I have to work very closely with the teachers I have. And there, it really depends on the student. How much does the student want academic success? And it depends on the instructor. How much academic success does the instructor have? And maybe Professor Tappan can discuss what success looks like from the teacher's perspective. But I think we both kind of had like an unspoken agreement of we both want the best for each other. And I think the way this developed over time is constant communication. I probably sent Professor Tappan way too many emails, and I probably spoke to him way too frequently after class. Like, I would always go to him after class and would double, triple confirm things that I probably maybe didn't need to do. I admit that. But some of that I think helped build up the connection we have. And one story that I think is really interesting to tell is other students would notice it. So I took my third class I took with Professor Tappan was Islamic ethics. And in that course, we had a group project, and I wasn't really sure who to work with. So Professor Tappan handpicked my peers, and those were the best peers I ever had because I don't think I had a group in all of my education where things just worked. So it was a research project. We used some course materials, and I was always afraid to use the databases through the Towson Cook library because then we run into the issue of, oh no,
Right.
how do you get PDFs converted in such a short amount of time? So some of my peers were able to kind of pick up where I couldn't. But then I also went to Professor Tappan and I said, oh, this is our topic. We discussed it in our previous class. I still have those readings in accessible format. Are you okay if we use them? And he agreed. And sometime during that project, all of my peers, the three peers I worked with, they said, and I felt really guilty because I didn't know what they were referring to at the time. They said, you and Professor Tappan have something really special. So I think that the connection, other students will notice it. And I just think that that group project kind of showed what a good student teacher connection can result in.
Awesome. And yeah, I would love to hear Dr. Tappan if you could give your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was one of the things too, and I hadn't completely had a concrete idea of this until Mohammed was talking about this earlier, but he mentioned just a few minutes ago how it can kind of be isolating as a student with, in his case, visual impairment, because you're spending so much time working on the material that is less accessible to you for whatever reason, that you don't have a lot of time for social activities and things like that. And I mean, if Mohammed was just taking Intro to Islam, that's one thing. That's, you know, a bigger class and it's a core and students come from all over the university to take that class. You don't necessarily expect people to make connections, but you know, by the second and third class, Mohammed's in 300 level classes. Some of them are core classes open to the university, but some of them are intended more for majors in our department. And we had a good group of majors in the same year as Mohammed was there. And you know, in class, Mohammed would always, even though he couldn't see who everyone was around him, he would respond to people's questions. You know, if Tom said something, Mohammed might answer his question or give some more feedback or add on to it. And students did that as well. And I could tell that other, you know, Mohammed's other classmates, especially our majors who would see him sort of semester after semester, wanted to kind of, you know, have a relationship with him, like that, you know, get to know him, because he's always there. He's a great student. But he's like, you know, taking notes fast and furious and answering questions, but there's kind of a wall there, right? Because it's harder to communicate with each other in those circumstances. So when we had that group project, I thought, oh yeah, this is let me put Mohammed with these majors who he knows, at least, you know, through their voices and their ideas, and let them work together, because it seemed like both parties were interested in getting to know each other a little bit better. And I thought this could also help, you know, them meet Mohammed meet them, and relieve some of that isolation that you might.
Right. And really, and Mohammed and I talk about this all the time, just based on the field that we're in, but that gets into a whole other space of, you know, how maybe intimidating it might be to see somebody with a visual impairment and not know how to approach them and not know how to initiate that interaction. And then being somebody, even myself being somebody with low vision, if I'm in a crowded room and the lighting is dim, it's like I can't really pick out people's faces either. So then there's this, there is like this wall that's up. And of course, that's a totally different topic from academics and academic success in college. But it is it is related to, the class experience in a university. So I think that that's really interesting as well. Cool. I wanted to give you both last question. I'll start with Mohammed. Mohammed, what is one piece of advice or something that you would want somebody to take away if they have a visual impairment and they're about to enter college? What advice would you give them?
Sure. So I have two things I'd like to say, and one is more intended towards TVIs. So I'm very thankful for the compliments Cody and Professor Tappan gave, but those skills do not come just naturally. So I in high school had a TVI who would continuously get on me about advocating for myself. And I'm sure Cody has so much experience with this, where us students, sometimes we know what we need, but we don't want to go and disrupt something. Like, we don't want to say, oh, can I please have this? Because most people won't do that. So this one TVI, she would say, okay, well, if you don't ask for whatever, then you're just not going to get it. And, good luck. And so her being more direct kind of helped. And so that's my advice to TVIs. Tell your students, encourage them to advocate, because they can be just like me, if not better. If you don't speak up, then the student won't get what they want. In terms of students, to answer your question, Cody, always communicate. The best thing you can do with your teachers is communicate. Most of my professors usually didn't mind it when we came into office hours or emailed, or in Professor Tappan's case, me sticking around after class, helping. If you're communicating, it helps the instructor, but it also helps you, the student, because that's how that bond, that connection develops. Professor Tappan and I didn't have this connection just out of the box. It developed, thankfully, over time into something really nice, and I think it's because we both kept in touch.
Absolutely. Awesome. And Dr. Tappan, from your perspective, what advice would you give a student with a visual impairment going into college? What would you say?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and besides some of the other things we've talked about, I think advice that I give all students is helpful. When we do advising, it's something that I was told my very, probably first day of college by my advisor, who said, take professors, not classes, when you can, right?
Right.
So of course that there's limits on that. You got to take who you got to take for your major or what's open in your schedule. But as much as you can, learn from your fellow students, who professors are that you're going to resonate with and that are willing to work with you. In Mohammed's case, he had at least one faculty who he got on with, and at least one faculty who said, don't even bother. So, you're able to kind of pass that knowledge on,
right.
Whether it's specifically about accessibility issues or whether it's just about somebody who's going to be open-minded and work with you. Getting the word of mouth can be good. I appreciate Mohammed saying he never heard a bad word about me. We all have rate my professors and things like that. You can't please everybody, but
right.
Those kind of things, either people love you or hate you, but word of mouth from your peers especially can really help solidify if this is going to be a good fit for you or not. So that might be one way to do it.
Yeah. And I think really just to expand on that, I love we talked about the student and teacher connection, but really being connected within your community, whether that's even if, we can get even down to if you're going to a university and there's another student with a visual impairment there, what professors are, ask that student, what professors are good? What professors have you taken? What are the bad professors? What are the professors that haven't accommodated you at all? And being connected in that community with your disabled peers and your non-disabled peers. I think that's a great piece of advice.
And when I would talk about Professor Tappan, so here's the thing. So I had a visually impaired peer, same major. We would have these discussions all the time. Oh, you should take so-and-so and MCOM because they're gonna accommodate you. You shouldn't take so-and-so. But that student didn't take any of Dr. Tappan's classes. Instead, what I was surprised with was when I would interact with Professor Tappan's other students, some of whom were maybe not in my classes, but we would have this discussion of, what did you think of Professor Tappan? And the first thing I would say is super accommodating. That would be like the number one thing. There are other, like, I wish I could start with the lectures are really well put together, which in my opinion they always were, or Professor Tappan always is passionate and knowledgeable about the topics he discusses. That's usually where my peers started, right? They always began with, oh, we really like the lectures, he's really good. I always, even though that's the same thought I had, I would always start with super accommodating. The anything accessible, anything related to accessibility, you're gonna get with this one professor at Towson. That's where I started, and then all my other peers would kind of come in and talk about Dr. Tappan, I guess the way you would talk about another excellent professor.
Right. Right. And it's interesting that you have different starting points, right? That's really interesting.
That's like the number one thing that my visually impaired peers and we look at. We like the number one thing we talk about is, okay, so who's going to be willing to work with us and who's not.
Yeah.
Then we get to the regular student stuff like, oh, well, can this professor, teach us well? Can,
right.
How are the readings? What are the papers like? That usually doesn't come until later on in the discussion for us.
Awesome. I love it. Well, this discussion has been really enlightening. I thank you both for coming on and giving your opinions. Definitely fresh perspectives for sure. Thank you again. And for all of you guys listening, think about some other perspectives that you might want to hear from, and comment on the video below, because we are always open to doing these. They're very easy to do. So put your comments below and we'll see you in the next Voices for VIPs.